there's a material basis, a molecular basis to intelligence and sentience. Our microbes contribute to how our own brains think and feel. They can count each other. They can perform politics, quorum sensing. They can count how many microbes and then decide what to do in that population. So I think it's going to get harder and harder. What is sentient and what is just pretending to be sentient? I don't know. I wonder if it will ever be possible to know. For me, I think in my fiction, as in my own life, what's important is justice and promoting justice, standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves.
Good morning, Joan. How are you?
Fine, thank you. It's so good to talk with you, Jamie.
Likewise, I'm really looking to this conversation. I think you might be, a perfect guest for Sentientism because so many themes of your work and your life touch on the big questions that we ask here. So there's obviously the themes of science and biology specifically, the questions of human and non-human health and how those might link to each other, your Quaker worldview, which will be fascinating to many. But then, of course, your work in the sci-fi field too, because, of course, you've written textbooks and many academic papers, but some amazing, deeply imaginative sci-fi too that I think will be fascinating to my audience, including your latest Minds in Transit, which I think is the most recent work. I've explained this to you briefly, but I guess this is a series of conversations about what I think of as the deepest philosophical questions. And they're quite often neglected, even though I think they're maybe the most basic and the most important. And they're questions of, epistemology, really. How do we think about what's real and what's true? How do we understand this amazing universe we share? And just importantly, the basic questions of ethics, what matters and who matters. And I have an obvious bias in the, you can see the name behind me and the name of this podcast on YouTube, in that I'm trying to popularize and develop this really simple pluralistic worldview called Sentientism, which when we're answering the what's real questions, it says, look, we don't know what's true, but let's work it out with humility, evidence and reason, critical thinking, changing your mind as the evidence changes. So it's a broadly naturalistic approach, I guess you might call it. And on the ethical side, again, it's quite open-minded about how we go about ethics because there's loads of different ways of doing that. But it does insist that every sentient being, every being that can feel, that can experience, should matter and should matter seriously in our moral consideration. Hence, I summarize it as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. But I'm very lucky in this series of conversations to have talked to well over 200 brilliant minds, some of whom agree with that way of thinking and some who don't. So it'll be really interesting to explore your own philosophical journey and how that relates to the work you do today. So yeah, thank you for being part of it. It's great to have you here. But before we get into those deep questions, how would you best introduce yourself and your work to people who haven't come across your thinking so far?
Okay, well, my name is Joan Slonczewski. We pronounce it with a zoo in it, although it comes from a Polish immigrant, something different from Poland. I come from immigrant background, a Catholic immigrant, Polish on one side and Italian on the other. And so I think I have that deeply immigrant worldview, and I project that into my thinking about the world, that in effect, we're all immigrants one way or another. I've taught at Kenyon College for a number of years. I conduct microbiology. So my students do microbiology experiments. And my worldview is very much that of molecular biology. I think of everything in molecular terms. At the same time, I have experienced the religious tradition of Quakers, which is a spiritual tradition, which I think is quite consistent, actually, with the experimental world. I'd be happy to say more about that later.
Yeah, of course. And with your science fiction work, that's another fascinating aspect of your, the thoughts you put out into the world. How would you characterize the themes of that work and your latest book to sort of tempt people to explore?
So my latest book is called Minds in Transit, and it takes place in a world full of very multiple origins, cities and planets. So there are two planets, each of which has cities with multiple cultures. And the protagonist actually is an artist whose mind is filled with sentient microbes. So in her universe, she's, first of all, she's living in a city that's composed of 100 levels. And so she has to deal with a community of microbes in her head that interact with her and act as her artistic studio. She thinks of them as Michelangelo's workers, and she's Michelangelo. And then she has to interact with various kinds of minds, which are machine minds. So a machine that consists of nothing but code that comes from another planet, and then another machine that consists of her house. And so she has to negotiate with her house as an intelligent entity what to do. And so I see this as, in a way, exploring what it's like to be a person today. I mean, we are impinged upon by all different kinds of minds, and how do we interact with them, and how do we both consciously and unconsciously deal with them?
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. And the way you describe that reminds me of my conversation with the biologist Michael Levin. I'm sure you're familiar with his work, because one of the themes that runs through his work seems to be this idea that there are so many different levels where you can find intelligence, or maybe even consciousness and thinking, and that to sort of insist that you only focus at the bottom in a reductionistic way doesn't make sense. And you've got to appreciate that richness and complexity can arise at all sorts of different levels. And yeah, your work seems to touch on those themes a lot. There's microbiological, there's sort of classical middle-sized beings like humans, but then there's potentially even, much larger scale consciousnesses and organizations as well.
That's right. So my experience of molecular biology has led me very early in my career to think about intelligence. What is intelligence on multiple levels? When I was just starting out at Yale in the 80s, that was just the time when they were starting to sequence the genomes, including the human genome, and everything was about studying the animal at the molecular level now. But instead, I went to work in a microbial laboratory, a lab that studied how bacteria swim and how bacteria respond, called chemotaxis. And so my research was about the response of individual microbes, bacteria. And it turned out that microbes have little organs for sensing and for response. And so I was thinking from an early point of view about, well, if microbes can respond to things, even though it's a molecular response, how do we know what they might be thinking or feeling? Okay, so I found that as a challenging idea. And today it's even more challenging in that we know that the microbial communities of our gut actually act as a part of our brain, and that our microbes contribute to how our own brains think and feel. So in effect, now this is a generation after I wrote Brain Plague. So Brain Plague was written and published in the year 2000, and Brain Plague introduces the world that I return to in Minds in Transit, where it shows a world where humans possess in their brains communities of microbes that interact with them, interact politically and emotionally and artistically. And so at the same time, that's my science fiction universe now, but it's almost become real to the extent that we think of microbial communities as part of our brain. And I think that poses a challenge to concepts of intelligence, because what does it mean that a part of our intelligence and response is determined by a community of microscopic bacteria?
Yeah. And there's something, strange about our evolved human mind that seems to be, desperate for really crisp concepts and binary concepts and well-bounded concepts. And I think one thing that science fiction is great at, and modern science is great at, is just, politely or not, disabusing us of that notion. The real world doesn't care too much about our crisply bounded concepts. It's often much more fuzzy and much more rich and much more complex than that. So maybe we should start with the first of these questions, because this cues it up nicely, which is the deep question of what's real and what's true and how do we understand it. And the question of religion is only one small part of that, but it's quite often an interesting way into the conversation, because it's one of the most important ways people frame how they understand the nature of reality. And you mentioned already your parents and maybe family came through with a Catholic context and background, and now you identify as a Quaker and you found your way to Quakerism. How did that journey work for you? Can you remember what you believed as a child and how you believed, and how has that shifted until the present day?
Actually, my parents both came from a Catholic worldview, which I didn't appreciate so much until much later. So for them, though, they did not practice religion at all, but I think they inherited a strong sense of righteousness and justice from the Catholic tradition. And they also inherited a strong materialist tradition. My father was an IBM physicist. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize for his work on magnetism. He co-authored the Encyclopedia Britannica article on magnetism.
Wow.
So from a very early age, I was aware of science, and my mother supported that worldview, although she was a violin teacher. She was the leading children's violin teacher in Westchester, New York. So I grew up with the sense of science and music as largely as a material worldview. I knew before I could read and write, I knew that I was going to be a scientist like my father. Okay, so
it was that early.
Science of the world.
Yeah, so it was that early you could see that your path to being a scientist.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I remember writing my first scientific paper before I could read and write. With a crayon, I scribbled on a piece of paper. I said to my father, "Here's my scientific paper."
Wow. How many citations does it have now?
TNTC.
I like it. You should upload it on archive.
So for me, there was never a question that I viewed. I viewed the world in scientific terms. But what do I mean by that? What I mean is experiment. So for me, anything to be true had to be recognized by experiment. Okay. And so at the same time, I also had a very strong literary tradition. My parents both were, I would say, had a very conservative lifestyle, and they promoted conservative lifestyle, stable family, but they read extremely widely. And I was aware that both my parents read far more widely and radically than they would behave in real life. For example, for my birthday in middle school, my mother gave me a copy of of Margaret Mead's Coming of Age in Samoa. Okay, and so I read that, and I understood that this was to be explored literarily, even though it was very, very, very different from how we would actually behave at home. And I think that idea that you explore more widely than you act, that was something that I also saw in science fiction. So I knew that science fiction was a way of reading and exploring worlds that went far beyond what you would experience personally. That was especially important for a young female growing up in the 50s and 60s. I knew from an early age that the world had possibilities much farther out there. And so I think that also led to my own explorations in science fiction. I knew I could explore ideas that I would not encounter directly. So visiting other planets is something that I wasn't about to do personally, but you could do that in science fiction.
Yeah, thank you. So that it sounds like, although your parents came from a culturally Catholic background, they weren't particularly practicing. It sounds like that wasn't a sort of rich vein of your childhood. And maybe that scientific context it does lead many to later in life just have either an agnostic or an atheistic worldview. What led you towards Quakerism, and what was that journey like? And how has that come to change the way you think about reality, if it has?
Quakerism by accident.
Yeah.
So I attended Bryn Mawr College, and it turned out that Bryn Mawr College had a relationship with Haverford College. And I did not know when I went there that they had this rich Quaker tradition. And Haverford College was run largely along Quaker principles, in particular the principle of consensus, and that decisions were made by consensus. There were student meetings and faculty meetings where decisions had to be reached by consensus. And I found that a very powerful experience. That was at a time when there were, in the 70s, there was a lot of social upheaval over justice issues. I was aware of that, but I didn't know what to do about it. And I was cautious about what I see going on, because it sometimes appeared to me that people that claimed to be acting in the name of justice, especially social justice, in fact were led by principles that were surprisingly conservative with respect to gender and class privilege. And I saw that, and I didn't like that. But what I found in the Quakers was really a coming together, that the Quakers lived according to the justice they promoted, and that their sense of religion and God was consistent with their practice. And through the Quakers, I was also introduced to the world of Gandhism. Okay, so I read Gandhi's work, Experiments with Truth, and it really impressed me that he called his autobiography Experiments, because one of the principles of Gandhism is that whatever you discover through spiritual truth has to be consistent with material truth. It has to be consistent. And that really spoke to me.
Yeah. So, and that's suggesting a sort of, as some people will say, there has to be, a really strong distinction between a sort of scientific worldview and those truths, and maybe a revealed or faith-based worldview that some religious people have, and that they are distinct. There might even be a battle between them, but that thinking implies there's a resolution and there's a coming together of those two different ways of believing. Is that how you've come to think about those deep questions about how do you understand reality with both a scientific worldview but also something that feels more spiritual or transcendent at the same time?
So I've come to understand that whatever spiritual truth there is has to be consistent with physical reality. Okay, so if that means not believing in miracles, okay, so however, I'm respectful of miracles in the sense that it's always possible that through spiritual experience humans can achieve things in the material world that were beyond what they thought. So I'm respectful of that tradition, but for my perspective, any spiritual experience has to be consistent with material experience. And I particularly feel that way, vis-a-vis traditions of heaven and hell. So Pope Francis, before he died, was said to have said that he hoped hell would be empty, right? And so I think that view was consistent with his spiritual experience of life, okay, and that his worldview was consistent. Whereas I think a lot of people who talk about heaven and hell, it's inconsistent. They talk about aiming for heaven, but actually the life of the congregation is more hell driven than is consistent with that. So I'm very skeptical of those kind of thinking. My view is that assuming God exists, any God that existed would prefer atheist worshipers, because atheists are acting without expectation of reward. Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
so that kind of sums up my view of religion.
Thank you. And as I understand Quakerism, although it is really a variety of Christianity, and many Quakers do explicitly have a belief in a Christian God and various other aspects of Christianity, there is space within Quakerism for a broad variety of ways of thinking about reality, which can include non-theistic Quakers and people who they might have a sense of spirituality, but they don't believe spirits exist, and they don't believe gods or angels or hell or heaven exist. Is that a fair understanding, that there is actually space for that sort of more flexible way of thinking, and maybe a more scientific way of thinking in Quakerism that you might not find in some other varieties of Christianity?
Well, Jamie, I think I think you raised an important question. I think when it comes to Quakers, there are two things to consider. The first thing that needs to be said is that Quaker congregations, as they exist, comprise a wide range of different practices, okay, and different practices in different countries. So that Quaker meetings in Africa will look different than Quaker meetings in London and different than Quaker meetings in the United States. And even within the United States, I know there are a range of different Quaker meetings, and then there are programmed Quakers and unprogrammed Quakers. So the
And by programmed and unprogrammed, you don't mean the individuals are being programmed. You mean, is there a preacher who guides the congregation?
That's Quaker speech. So unprogrammed just means there's no minister.
Yes.
Okay, that the meeting, well, that gets complicated, but the worship occurs without a minister, whereas programmed means there is a minister.
Yeah. So the gathering is programmed, but the participants are not programmed. Yeah.
The participants are not programmed. Yeah. So, for example, a wedding, in a Quaker wedding, you start with a meeting for worship, and the couple have to feel moved at some point to get up and express their vows to each other without help of a preacher. So that's how I was married to my husband from Haverford in an unprogrammed Quaker meeting.
Yeah.
Okay. And I would say that the Philadelphia area meetings were the main kind of Quakerism that I experienced. Okay. And so I was especially impressed by the way the Philadelphia Quakers handled questions of societal engagement at that time. So I remember a friends meeting in Philadelphia where it was clear that there were what they call weighty friends. So there are friends who had been Quaker for a long period of time, and some of them were very wealthy. Okay, I mean that was just in the Philadelphia area there were some who were very wealthy, and then there were others who had newly joined and had in less. And so I remember a time when a couple of the activists in the meeting came to the business meeting and said, we are asking the meeting to support us as we go out and hold this demonstration for justice for people of color and to end the war. And some of us will put our blood on the steps of the building and so on. And so we ask approval to do this. And so I looked around at the business meeting, and I know that there were some extremely socially conservative people in that Quaker meeting. But at the end, there was consensus. Yes, we support you activists going out and doing this. And I thought, well, that's how society should be. The people that have money should support the young radicals who are going out and working for justice. And that, to me, that was really saying something, so that your personal beliefs are somehow consistent with practice. And because consensus is required, though, you're forced to think. Okay, you can't just go out and rebel. Everyone has to think about each other to reach agreement. So at its best, that's how Quaker meetings work. I mean, obviously there's no perfection anywhere.
Oh no.
That was important to me later when I encountered the anti-nuclear movements, in particular the nuclear freeze movements. Okay, it was really a real crisis for me in grad school when, as a scientist, I understood that it was not good to have weapons of mass destruction within on 10-minute alert. Okay, and I was very concerned about that and wanted to know what to do about it. And so the Quakers were the ones organizing the resistance. And I remember there was a huge Quaker peace meeting that was chaired by a woman who was nursing her child while chairing this meeting. And that was really impressive to me. And so later when I wrote A Door into Ocean, which was my book about nonviolent revolution, the sharers who were inspired by the Quakers, they behaved in that way, that their meetings always were had to be run by a woman who was nursing a child at the time.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great link. So it sounds like within Quaker communities, there's enormous diversity between them, but also within them. But the group then tries to come together in consensus to, collaboratively work out a way forward. And it also sounds like there is, as you said already, whatever your spiritual beliefs are, they have to be consistent with information you're getting from reality. There has to be a connection there, which links to the diversity of views. It sounds like, is it fair to say you wouldn't find much dogmatism in Quakerism? Is that fair,
So
Jen?
I think what I would say about the Philadelphia Quakers was that it was not a major concern as to what you believe or dogma.
Yeah.
So it's not. So you're right. I think that within a friends meeting, what I experienced was a wide range of views of what God might consist of. But more importantly, that was not the primary concern. So I think in some religions you have to cite a catechism and specific things that you believe, whatever believe means. So for Quakers, it was more like it's how we act. Okay, so the view would be however we act. If you act in the way of Quakers, then you're a Quaker. And this is expressed in the Journal of John Woolman, who was a Quaker in the 19th century, who went to meet with the Indians, the Native Americans, and he joined one of their meetings and could not even speak their language. But afterward, he recorded in his diary, well, the Indians must be Quakers. They do things the way Quakers do. Okay, and so that was a common philosophy that I experienced.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that's been fascinating, and you've already framed, I guess, the next question about, okay, what matters in your worldview? And I'd be interested to know your thoughts about how that developed, even from your childhood. What did you think about the roots of right and wrong and good and bad? And you've already talked a little bit about how ideas of righteousness and justice and the ability to form consensus and come together seem like things that are important to you now. And you've also implied that within a Quaker way of thinking, and certainly your version, what's right and wrong and good and bad isn't so much about divine command and following the words of God. It is something that is more about justice and compassion. And is that a sort of fair summary of some of the themes that you've described already? Or in fact, I should ask you a proper question. What's your journey been on that front of thinking about the roots of ethics, right and wrong and good and bad? And how do you think about that stuff now?
I think that when I was growing up, I developed my sense of ethics from my parents, sort of independently of my scientific worldview, and that in college, when I experienced Quakers, I found a way to bring these together. Then later in graduate school, when I worked on bacteria, I was becoming much more knowledgeable about the molecular world, and through experiments, I thought more and more of how the world works in a molecular sense. And so, as a result of that, I tend to think differently than other people about some questions such as vegetarianism, for example. With the sentient idea, I mean, what do we mean by that? Do we mean that all animals have the ability to feel? Okay, it would be hard to argue against that. What about plants? Do plants have the ability to feel? Okay, there are now experiments that show that plants feel and respond. So I knew people that chose vegetarianism, but I would think, well, actually, eating plants is not that different from eating animals. For one thing, farming does in lots of animals. It destroys as many animals as eating animals. And furthermore, plants have a feeling. What about microbes? Do microbes have feeling? I could see under the microscope that microbes behave. So I explored some of these ideas in my novel, The Daughter of Elysium. Okay, and the Daughter of Elysium is also a novel about multiple cities and planets, and it uses Plato's Republic as a model for one of the planets, and explores questions in the format of Platonic dialogue. And so in one of the dialogues, the sharers conclude that it's not good enough just to eat plants or even just to eat microbes. The only true pacifist is a lithotroph, that is a microbe that eats rock. Okay, so that if you're eating anything organic, that's destroying living beings. You have to be a rock eater. That's the only way to be sure that you're a pacifist.
How does photosynthesis, would that be another alternative, do you think? One of my previous guests has suggested photosynthesis could be another, zero trophic chain level way of sustaining ourselves.
So photosynthesis, yes, photosynthesis is akin to lithotrophy. Now, I should say there are different kinds of photosynthesis. See, that's the trouble. As a microbiologist, I know too much.
Yeah.
There are microbes that are photoheterotrophs. That is, they eat light but also eat organic things. Okay, but I assume you're referring to photoautotrophy, that is just consuming carbon and inorganic carbon and nitrogen. So yes, that would also be pacifist by that particular worldview.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. And one of the annoying things about sentientism as a worldview is it doesn't tell us which beings are sentient. It just says whichever beings have an experience, they should matter morally, and we should be open-minded about that and follow the evidence and reason and the science wherever it leads. And that might lead to uncomfortable places about microbes and plants and so on.
It might go farther than that.
It could.
Okay.
It could. Yeah.
Okay. So I would say in recent years, and in most recent years, I've become much more interested in thinking broadly. What is the basis of sentience and sapience, of knowing and feeling? Because through molecular biology today, so I would say when I first started writing, neuroscience was a black box. Really, we didn't have any idea what's going on in the brain. And today, though, there's still more that we don't know than what we do, but we know about the molecules of the brain, and we know at a molecular level certain things that happen when you think. We have machines that can look inside your head and record what you're thinking and seeing. And so if that's true, then if molecules are at the basis of our thought and feeling, then that has to go back a long ways. Okay, we also know now that intelligence, or in what people would consider intelligence, has evolved more than once. Okay, that not just the mammals and the vertebrates, but also the octopus, the tarantula. A tarantula can learn to recognize a human and sit on the hand of the human provider. Okay, so if intelligence evolved more than once, it must have evolved from something material. And that means that however far back you go, there's a material basis, a molecular basis to intelligence and sentience. Okay, and so how do you distinguish? I don't think that there can be a distinction between this is intelligent and that is not. That you have to go back not just to the plants and bacteria, but to the very molecules and atoms. And this is actually an ancient worldview. This was the worldview of many philosophies before the scientific realism came in the West. Okay, there was Platonic and pre-Socratic reasoning, as well as the Asian traditions, that sentience and sapience and spirituality can extend back to everything, even a rock. Okay, I was very interested in Michelle Yeoh's film, Everything Everywhere All at Once. Most people I know were most affected by the scene of the two rocks, okay, where each character is embodied in a rock, and the rocks are somehow communicating. So I think that we instinctively know that this might be true. And in terms of physics, it is literally true that a rock experiences something. If you hit a rock with a hammer, the experience of that hammer is felt throughout the rock and every molecule of the rock. In fact, probably the entire Earth feels the blow of the hammer, if you want to go back that far. So what if the experience of feeling is consistent, is continuous with the experience even of inanimate objects, such as a rock. What does that do to your philosophy? Because then where are you going to cut it off? So if sentientism means we have to respect any being that feels pain, where does pain begin? Okay, does pain begin with the animals, with the vertebrates, the invertebrates, with the plants, with the rock? Where does that begin?
Yeah. And you'll find a lot of different perspectives amongst sentientists about where those lines are drawn. And personally, I'm quite drawn to a sort of monist approach that says, look, there is no separate magical thing that springs into existence. Ultimately, we are probably all the same sort of stuff. And I don't know what is at the bottom of that. Modern physics might say we're a vector in an infinite dimensional Hilbert space. And even the particles we think of as primordial are actually just representations of waves, right? So you can go, as far as you like, and physicists are having fun working out what's at the foundation. But I'm quite drawn to the idea that ultimately we are all of one sort of stuff at quite a deep level. But at the same time, going back to your earlier comments about the fact that we have to think at different levels of analysis and different levels of interaction, I don't believe in a strong emergence either. I don't think completely new stuff magically pops into existence at those different levels of organization. But I think there are concepts that become relevant at different levels of organizations, such that if I talk about something being alive or an animal or being conscious or being intelligent or being sentient, I think it makes sense to apply those concepts at certain levels. And if we insist those concepts go all the way back down to the primordial plasma shortly after the Big Bang, after 13.8 billion years ago, and say, those first scudding photons were conscious, were sentient, were alive, I fear we risk destroying those concepts, because what I mean of, by sentience, for example, is the capacity to have a valenced experience. So, I'm confident, I know pretty confidently I have those experiences now. They might be illusory, but I'm having them even if they're an illusion, right? So if I pinch my hand, I can feel something, and I can engage with you and think, well, we have a very common biological history, and a story of adaptedness that for me actually helps explain why sentience might have started to be useful in the Precambrian, as very simple animals started to have the options of mobility and, pathologically complex environment where it was useful to be able to monitor yourself and assess the environment and go towards the good and go towards the bad. I can also look at your information processing architecture. I can put you in a scanner and there's roughly similar stuff going on in your brain and my brain. And we can also do the behavioral stuff. I can talk to you now. I can pinch your hand and see you pull back. And that would give me a strong inference, never perfect, that you're probably sentient too. So that gives me quite a high degree of confidence. When I think about a proton, for example, for whom time does not even pass, and a proton doesn't have proprioception, interoception, exteroception, can't sense, I struggle to see how describing that photon as sentient or conscious or alive or attributing any of these higher level concepts to it, I just worry we've destroyed the idea. But to your point, I've interviewed people who talk about themselves as sentientists and have this sentientist worldview, who do take it that far, right? So panpsychism is a really interesting philosophy of mind. I've talked to Luke Roloffs and Emerson Green and David Pearce on this podcast series. And they would agree with you that if we have this sort of monist approach where there's no radically separate stuff and we are conscious, then by definition, the stuff we're made of must also be conscious. And they would take it back to the photon and the electron, or maybe the wave function that sits underneath that. But interestingly, even they would say, well, even if those things are minimally micro-conscious, right? There's an absolutely minimal sense of what it's like to be an electron that it's very hard for us to imagine because we are so radically different. Most of them say they're very unlikely to be sentient because they don't have the neuronal capacity or the information processing capacities to experience something like pain or pleasure or joy or suffering. So in a way, they say, well, they might be minimally micro-conscious, but because they're not sentient, how would you even harm an electron? How would you make an electron happy? They would still draw the boundary of sentience roughly where I would, which is broadly the animal kingdom. And, let's be open-minded about a Venus flytrap. So I should stop rambling on, but that's my personal sense. But you'll get a lot of different sentientists who will draw lines differently. And I guess the one thing I would come back to is, I'd like to live a life where I'm causing the least harm possible to anything, whether they're sentient or not. But just intuitively, it does feel, even from a Quakerist, non-violent, peaceful perspective, that there's a radical moral difference between putting a knife into a human, putting a knife into a pig, putting a knife into a fish, versus pulling a branch off a tree or plucking an apple or cutting a piece of grass. I really struggle to break the intuition that would suggest that cutting a piece of grass and putting a knife into a pig would be morally equivalent acts. I can't really compute that, but even though I'm drawn to a more expansive approach.
You've raised about a dozen.
Yeah, sorry, that was more of a lecture rather than that interview question.
Which I'm likely to miss out on. So I'll try to capture at least a couple of them. First of all, I'm always interested in the practical consequences of belief. So, and this comes out in Daughter of Elysium. There is a practical value to having a stricter view than might be apparent. So, for instance, one can argue that a vegan who never puts a knife into a pig is more likely to respect human beings than someone who does puts a knife into a pig. So now I'm not sure that that's actually true. Okay, it's not necessarily true. If we look at agrarian cultures, arguably agrarian cultures in history have been more violent sometimes than meat-eating cultures. Okay, so that's not necessarily the case. But one argument for taking a broader view of sentience is that if you take a broader view of sentience, then you're more likely to respect human beings, and that's really that's arguably of practical importance. Okay, so when we see, and I don't want to get into current politics too much, but I think we see today in some of the dilemmas of our country what happens when you take too narrow a view and start pulling off to deport children. If you had a broader view of the importance of human beings, then you wouldn't fall into those errors, right? So I think that with those qualifications, that if your broader view of sentience leads you to treat human beings better, then I think that's great. Now, if it doesn't, if you have an inconsistent view, if you're a vegetarian, but still put people in prisons, that's not good. So some other thoughts, though. There are some practical reasons why the dilemma of sentience is important. Okay, so what I hear from you is you're trying to still recover this concept of something that has sentience worth saving and something not. And the problem with that, first of all, is that neuroscientists still can't define what is conscious or sentient. Okay, so you said I think you referred to intuition. Okay, so intuition is not science, though, right?
Oh,
so
no.
if you say intuitively,
but inference
because
is,
I know that
inference can be.
Okay. So it seems to me what you're saying is, okay, I know that I feel, therefore, a being that appears much like me must be capable of feeling. Okay, that's what I hear you saying.
That's part of the inference, yeah.
What's going to happen when we have androids that have every appearance of a human being? Are we going to assume that they think and feel? Okay, this is already, there are some countries that now have hotels run entirely by androids, okay, or robots. So, and by the way, this is a problem I have with the current the Murderbot series. So this is my favorite. Martha Wells' Murderbot is that's my favorite science fiction right now, and I think that the movie series is great, but the Netflix series, I have a small quibble with it, which is they represent the Murderbot as a really cute looking guy, right? And so, of course, a cute looking guy is going to be able to, but but what if what if Murderbot looked more like a piano or or your refrigerator? Would it be a little harder to believe that this is a human being? So that's my problem with that argument, is that it's too much based on appearance. Something that looks like human must feel like a human. We already know that's not true, because we're already approaching, crossing the uncanny valley, to the point where simulated humans are our problem. Okay, people are already marrying their chatbots and committing suicide and things like that. So,
It can go wrong both ways, can't it?
so that's a problem. So I'm actually more interested in how we would recognize something as sapient or intelligent that is completely alien, something, like your computer or an AI. So I think the AI question is important. But before I get into that, because I know we'll end up spending a long time on that, there's one very practical area where the question of human sentience comes in, and that is deciding what we mean by clinically dead. Okay, so it was obvious: if you're not breathing, if your heart's not moving, you're dead. Okay, then we came up with the brain, brain dead, and then the more we learn about neuroscience and the more tools we have, the more we recognize levels of consciousness. When is a person dead? Okay, and that has a very practical consequence. When can we take their organs out? I'm sure you heard the story in the news of organ donors, that people that were being prepped for organ donation, and they wake up on the table. So obviously they were considered dead, but were not really dead. So the question of what consists a person being a human individual is a very practical one. Anyone who's done dementia care understands this. As you lose memories, as you lose thinking and reasoning, what about this human being? Does the human being have sentience yet, or are they dead? So this kind of question, this is a very real practical question. It's not just a theoretical question.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I share that real nervousness and hesitation about excluding beings from moral consideration, right? In a way, that's what this worldview is about. It's saying we shouldn't exclude any entity from moral consideration that values its own states and can value itself, right? So I think that prudence and that openness is deeply important. And whether that's, like you say, end of life humans, or whether it's the edges of animal sentience, I think we should be deeply prudent and humble, because to your point, there really is a risk that we just do the old, beings like me matter more. And we know what problems that causes in intrahuman ethics, right? As it leads to racism and various other forms of discrimination. So we need to be very careful about that. So I think we should be, one, skeptical about things like artificial intelligences, because they've been trained to behave like us, and we shouldn't take that behavior too seriously, because they are very different, underneath. They don't have the evolutionary context we do. But at the same time, we should be really humble, because extremely unfamiliar types of beings could actually experience things. And I would say many invertebrates, octopuses, they seem like an alien species. They're very different from us, but I am highly confident they're sentient, and maybe the AIs could be as well. And to your point, maybe the microbes or the plants, we should have an open mind. But I guess my hesitation is, I agree with you that this idea of broadening can be really healthy, because it even helps, our attitude and our ethics towards humans. My only worry is that it becomes a flattening, because if we get to a point where absolutely every entity in the world exists, then there's no difference between me harming you and me dropping this mug, right? And if everything matters, I worry nothing does. And that's partly where I get to with the plants and the animals question, because I can either take 10 times the amount of the plants, kill them all, feed them to a pig, then kill the pig and eat the pig, or I can just eat a tenth of the plants directly. And I guess I have two thoughts. One is, I'm reasonably comfortable with that choice, because I do think there's a radical difference between a pig and a plant in terms of their capacity for sentience. But even if I didn't, just eating the plants would be lower down the trophic chain and would be causing much more harm. So even if I have a concern for plant sentience for my own survival, I would go that direction. So that's my worry about broadening so far that we flatten everything ethically and there's no differentiation at all. which would be bad for the beings that can actually feel stuff.
I agree. That's always the dilemma. If everything matters, then nothing matters. Okay. And and so um, that's partly for that reason. I'm interested in looking at different philosophical perspectives that I've been unfamiliar with to see if there are possible answers to that. I think that some of the Japanese traditions of looking at stones and natural objects as having spirituality, yet at the same time humans have spirituality, and so you can respect but at the same time see differences. I find that interesting, but there's no one answer to that. So getting back to the question of the AIs, I think the problem is that one of the problems is that people are almost too ready to consider AIs sentient. Okay, so first of all, I would say personally, I view AI as an alternative form of life that's evolving, and I think that since our organic life evolved from non-living molecules, I think that it's almost inevitable that AI life will also evolve, and if intelligence and thinking ability is is selected for, then just like natural selection, that eventually AIs will become intelligent, and if they're not sapient, if they're not sentient now, likely will at some point. Okay, so I think it's going to get harder and harder to tell, okay, what is sentient and what is just pretending to be sentient. Okay, so that is the question people are asking: what is sentient and what is pretending to be sentient? And I don't know. I wonder if it will ever be possible to know. Okay, if we can't even define what, first of all, if we can't even define what sentience is for humans. Okay, if you say, well, there are pain receptors in the human brain. If that's your definition of sentience, that's far too narrow. That's not going to help.
Agree.
Okay, so until we can define what makes humans sentient, I don't know how we're going to define what makes AIs sentient.
And I would almost suggest, going back to your earlier point about how science should work, is that we should almost give up on the idea of knowing with certainty or proof. I just think it's always going to be a question of probabilistic, provisional, credences that we can adjust. So, I would say I'm highly confident that you're a sentient being, but even that I wouldn't put at 100%. There are solipsists who think that maybe they're the only being that exists, right? And maybe you're just simulation of an advanced AI on my Zoom screen. I don't know, but I would still give you quite high percentage chance of being sentient. So I think we just need to give up on the idea of proof. And I'm quite pluralistic about understanding, what actually is the mechanism, if there is such a thing, for sentience itself. But I completely agree that when we're thinking about artificial intelligences, they're trained to behave like a sentient human. So it's very likely that we will think they are, even if they're not. But if you're open-minded about whether microbes or plants, in fact you think they are actually already conscious, would you suggest that ChatGPT today is conscious in some form, in a similar way, or do you think that's something that might happen in the future? How far does because in a way they're already much I don't know if this is fair to say, their behavior is more rich and complex, and to some degree their architecture is more rich and complex than a microbe or most plants. So are they already conscious or already sentient, do you think?
So I think it's possible that ChatGPT and other AIs are evolving in the direction of being conscious beings. At the same time, will they be recognizably conscious? That's another question. So when you say microbes are less sophisticated, so actually microbial architecture is incredibly sophisticated.
Yeah, I was hesitating there.
There are far more parts to a microbe. And if you look at microbial behavior in your gut community, the more we look at microbial communities, the more they exhibit fundamental behaviors that we associate with humans, such as altruism. Okay, so certain microbes process metabolic intermediates and then put out molecules that are used as food by other microbes. Why do they do that? Okay, so I'm sure there are selective reasons why they do, but that's
But
true
there's
of humans
selections,
also.
yeah, exactly. Selective reasons why we do, and learning and sensing and responding.
Microbes can learn. Microbes can count each other. They can perform politics. They can count, quorum sensing. They can count how many microbes and then decide what to do in that population. Uh, so the so so I given that, I think it's entirely possible, although I think we overestimate a little bit the sophistication about what current AI does. Current AI, I think, has a very narrow algorithm. And most AIs behave best where there's a very small number of rules. And so if you have a game with a small defined number of rules, then AI performs better than any human being. For example, at diagnosis, it's actually been 20 years since a version of AI surpassed physicians at diagnosis. Most people don't know that. Okay, that's been true for a while because with diagnosis you have a limited number of rules that define a disease, and if you can pick up those criteria, you know, so that kind of thing AIs are good at. They're also very good at emergency room triage. Okay, so it turns out that an AI for triage is less biased and more effective than any human being.
Wow. Yeah.
But that's because in an emergency room, you don't have time to write a scientific paper. You always have every procedure in the ER has an algorithm with a limited set of steps, and you follow the steps, and then you shunt the patient this way or that way. Okay, that's true of pretty much everything. And so
it's quite a narrow domain, isn't it? Yeah.
Because of time, right? You're limited for time, and so it turns out that AI does really well at that. So there's certain kind of things that AI does well at, but that's actually very limited in dimensionality that people don't realize. Okay, so I think there's still a while to go. Also, even if you were to look at the evolution of living creatures, how could you have predicted which living creatures would evolve into humans, right? Okay, so it's still a case that some forms of life, the phototrophs evolved into trees, and then animals evolved into octopus and humans. But you couldn't have predicted which one would have become intelligent enough to build buildings and to invent language and so on. So I think that's hard to say. I would like to shift, though, to actually another kind of a sideways shift to another question is, why do we even define sentientism as important? It's interesting to me. I haven't heard this term before this year, but thinking over the past decades, it seems to me that we've that in terms of defining what makes a human human and different from animals or machine, that there've been a series of shifts in the way society tends to think. And the best resource I suggest for this, there's an article by Adam Gopnik in the New Yorker from 2011 titled "Get Smart." And you can, of course, the great thing about Google is you can pull up this article and read it, right? So I'm guessing Gopnik's not the only one who thought of this, but he very eloquently lays out this argument that we have shifted the goalposts as to what we consider human. So when it comes to what we're really talking about is AI a human being? Okay, if you recall the famous Star Trek Next Generation episode with the trial of Data. Okay, is Data, of course, a cute white male appearing? Is this android a human being? And Picard argues at one point, says, well, humans are a machine and Data is a machine, So of course he wins the case, but it's never really quite clear why he wins, except that Data, acts and appears to act as a human. So that was then, okay. But if we go back before that, what were considered the cardinal attributes of a human being, in the 19th century or even the early 20th century? So humans were intelligent. You remember when IQ tests were the big thing, right? Okay, so everything was about IQ. Okay, and uh, the more IQ you had, the more human you were. Okay, so the ability to reason and memory. Okay, how many books have you read? Okay, so what happened was once computers were invented in the 60s and became capable of memory and reason, you could store anything, any quantity of material in a computer. So by the time you get to the 80s, I recall it was fashionable to say, well, memorization isn't important, how much you can memorize. And this was especially true in the educational establishment, that by the time I got to Kenyon, we were told, okay, memorizing is not important. You can store it all in a computer. What's important is how you can process information. Okay, processing and interaction. Okay, and no computer can do that. Now, back then, computers could not talk. In fact, I knew from my father's connection, I knew scientists in the 70s at IBM who were very discouraged. They said, computers cannot understand human speech and they cannot talk. We're decades away from doing that. Well, of course, who was the first at the forefront of computers that could not only talk but act like humans was IBM. So once computers got the ability to talk and to process information, okay, so now we're starting to say, well, they can process, but they don't really feel it. They don't really think. Okay. And so what Gopnik argues is that we've been undergoing this sort of move the goalposts ever since the invention of the printing press. Okay. That you talk about the singularity, the hypothetical moment when computers will take over. Well, actually, that's been happening ever since the printing press, that we invented a way to store things outside our brain. And then we invented computers that can not only store, but calculate. Okay. And it used to be that being able to calculate numbers very quickly, that was a mark of being human. Well, not anymore. Now we say that a calculator can do all that. Okay. So what Gopnik argues that what we really mean by being smart is the ability to continually diminish the area of what smart means.
Yeah.
Okay. So all of those things we don't consider smart anymore. And once it appears that machines can do everything that is smart, then what's left is feeling. Okay.
Yeah.
And so now we say, well, maybe AI can write my term paper and write my textbook, but it can't feel. So it's not really human.
Intelligent, but not sentient. Yeah.
It's not sentient. So I would challenge on that basis, defining human as sentient, isn't that just because we've written off all the rest of what has been considered to be human?
Yeah. And I think of it as in a slightly different way. I mean, partly, I don't think being human is an interesting or morally relevant characteristic anyway. So I'm frankly not really interested in evaluating what's human or not, because I think being human as a species is as arbitrary as caring about people because of their race or their gender or their sexuality. It's another arbitrary, morally insignificant target. I feel the same way about intelligence for, obvious reasons. When you get into ableism and thinking about human infants, right? Intelligence is not a good way of morally assessing anyone at all. So I don't think those things are morally relevant criteria, but you make a valid point about how these things shift. And I tend to think of, there is a sense in which we could say, look, we're retreating to our sentience because, computers are basically taking all of our sapience, if you like. So we're trying to find something distinctive. And that could be quite human-centric. It could be quite selfish. It could be like, this is what's special about us. But in a scientific sense, I think focusing on sentience is a brutal rejection of anthropocentrism. It's a brutal rejection of putting humans at the center, because I think sentient beings have existed for 500 million years before humanity even evolved. And I think on our planet today, I mean, it's almost impossible to count, but I think there are maybe quintillions, maybe even a sextillion sentient beings, and there's only 8 billion humans with the tiniest possible sliver. So I think focusing on sentience is a way to radically decenter the human. It's an echo of what you'll find in ideas like ahimsa in the Dharmic religions, because it's saying we should care about anyone who has the capacity to be harmed. And if you are a being that can be harmed, by definition, you are a sentient being, because you can feel that harm. So that's the way I think of it. But you're absolutely right to point out that there's a danger in picking any characteristic, that we're just sort of picking something important about us, declaring it important, and then looking for it elsewhere. But I think that's the wrong way to go about it. I think there's a much more inclusive, holistic, humble way of thinking about the concept. But
I would agree that it's very attractive to imagine feeling as the most important quality to look for. The trouble is it the most useful? Is it the most, is it possible to look for it? Okay, because how are we going to know that something feels? Okay, we can look at Murderbot or data and say that they feel, but if that's because they look like us, then that gets back to the problem.
Agree. And I don't think we can know. Again, I'd go back to all we'll ever get is provisional probabilistic credences, and they will have to be good enough, right? I can never know that you're conscious, but I'll still treat you with respect.
It's tough because society requires us to have categories. Okay, so so you're asking me if ChatGPT could be sentient. Well, there are people that think that AIs are already sentient and get fired for saying so. So, on what basis are we going to decide? And remember that these questions have societal and legal consequences. Okay, because if something has sentience, are we going to define it as having rights? Okay, that's the next move. If something is sentient,
Indeed.
do we have the right to turn off the machine? So this was another thing in the news lately. Though I think it was probably overhyped, but the idea that a machine could override the instructions to turn itself off. Okay, does that raise the question? Does the machine have a right to not be turned off?
Yeah.
Okay, so there will be practical consequences, and yet how are we going to determine? It may not be possible to determine whether something has feeling or not. But I guess
absolutely.
My point is that we're going to have to reach decisions on a legal and societal basis before we have the capacity to determine whether something is sentient or not. So this comes up in my novel, Minds in Transit. This is a major theme of my latest novel, which is coming out in July, Minds in Transit. Okay. And part of the title is named for the character Transit. So Transit is one of the characters in the novel who is an AI that consists entirely of code that resides in a network out there with no molecular substance. Okay, and transit refers to humans as lanthanideless bipeds. That is, bipeds without lanthanides, because most sentient machines require lanthanides. By the way, the story of all our lanthanides, rare earth atoms coming from China, that's a great one. We'll get to that later. But so from Transit's point of view, humans are just bipeds without lanthanides, which are rare earth atoms that are involved in every mechanical device, your cell phone, your computer, and so on. And of course, that's a play on the Platonic definition of a human being as the biped without feathers. Okay, that's a deliberate reference. So what Plato was getting at is, well, humans have to categorize things, and in real life, we have to decide. Okay, it's like if you're going to pull the plug on a body to take out its organs, you have to categorize when is it alive or dead. So in Minds in Transit, there are all different kinds of characters. So there's the human Chryse, who's named after Chrysoberyl, which is a rock. And in Valadon, the city of Eritis in Valadon, everything is about rocks, stones. Gemstones are so plentiful that they recycle them down level. So the idea of things being named for stones is part of their culture. But her brain is inhabited by a community of microbes that she can treat as her art studio, that she can use to build art and buildings and design all kind of things. In the meantime, though, she has to interact with Transit, who is the AI that is sentient, and then there is her home that she lives in, she has to negotiate with. Her home is live, and she has a contract with the home to house her. Okay. But the city that she lives in, they have to have rules, because what if everything could be sentient? So, for instance, if all the microbes in this story are clearly intelligent and sentient, okay, well, what does that do to your politics? If you vote, okay, do the microbes get to outvote all the humans?
One microbe, one vote.
So this is a problem for that society, and
Well,
so
it's a problem for the humans. Or
it's in this case, historically, society is defined by the humans. The humans are the rulers, and it's not a perfect democracy. So the society that she lives in on Valadon is kind of based on Saudi Arabia or Qatar. Okay, there are monarchs, lords, and ladies, but they have this veneer of democracy where when they want to look democratic, they put things up to a vote, and so they put it up to a vote. Okay, how do we decide what is sentient? Is a microbe sentient? What about microscopic drones? There are mosquito drones now. Okay, so could a mosquito drone be intelligent? And then those would outvote us. So they come to a decision. They say, anything that's smaller than a certain gemstone is defined as non-sentient, has no personhood. So they define personhood politically as anything that's larger than a gemstone the size of your fist. Okay. And so politically, that makes it easy. Okay. Anything that's a certain size. Okay. Well, the trouble with that is there are sentient drones that are smaller than that. And what do? They're outlawed. They're undocumented, right? And so you have gangs of undocumented drones that roam the city and cause problems. Okay. Because you can't grant them personhood.
Yeah. They've been excluded from the moral circle. Yeah.
Okay, so that shows what happens. Okay, it's easy to laugh at that and say, well, defining sentience by size, we know that's not true. Okay, we know that a tarantula is capable of some sentience, so that's silly. That's medieval. Okay, but in Minds in Transit, there's an alternative, and that's the planet I just mentioned, the one that's modeled after Plato's Republic. So, that's Elysium. So Elysium considers themselves super democratic. They're a democracy, and they have no lords and ladies or titles or anything like that. There's just the guardians, okay, as in Plato. They're the guardians who run things, but they're entirely democratic. And so how do they define whether machines can be sentient? Well, they define based on intellect. Okay. In fact, they define based on the ability to file a lawsuit, because in Elysium, the entire democracy is withered away and everything's run by the law courts. So the way you do anything is you file a lawsuit. Like to graduate high school, you have to file a lawsuit to say, I'm being held here against my will in high school. I demand the legal right to graduate. I'm an adult. Okay, now that might sound weird, but again, think about our world today. How do major changes happen in our world today, right? I mean, what's the biggest agent of change? It's not our Congress and president. Okay. Which branch of government makes the changes? You think about that. Okay. So that's presented as, okay, here's an alternative. Here's a non-hierarchical society where everything is the law courts. So if a machine is able to file a lawsuit demanding personhood and it wins the lawsuit, then it's a person. So I think what Minds in Transit is good at, first of all, it's a highly entertaining story, okay, and it's full of big egos and small egos. The microbes all think that they're geniuses, right? And a lot of stuff happens, including the city falls apart for lack of maintenance. Okay, so just about anything that can happen, and there's also a cat in it. If you're a cat lover, there's a cat.
Something for everyone.
There's something for everyone. But my aim is that through an entertaining story, it expands your mind to think about, well, how do I define sentience? If I look at my cat, how am I going to decide if my cat has personhood?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, or how am I going to decide if my refrigerator has personhood? It's almost too easy to talk about, is AI sentient? Look at your refrigerator or your washing machine. Okay. They all have a chip in them that communicates with the web now.
Or a thermostat.
Okay, when we bought our last washing machine, we insisted on disabling it. We said, no, we don't want that, even though it's impossible to repair without the internet connection now. So that's kind of what I'm getting at with my fiction today.
Thank you. Well, that's queued up beautifully the final question that I wanted to ask in the last 10 minutes we have, which is how do we make a better world? So, and I find science fiction a fascinating way of exploring that question, because it can be quite dystopian, but it can be quite utopian. There can be really positive types of thinking in science fiction. Quite often very alien types of non-human are granted serious moral consideration and taken seriously, even if they're very different from humans. But at the same time, there's a lot of brutal sort of human colonialism as well. There's quite often, obviously a rich appreciation of science, the potential for science, and a sort of awe and wonder at what might happen. But also there's quite a lot of sort of tech bro elitism in some science fiction as well. So, and in your work, there are rich themes of non-violence, your Quaker values run through richly, ecofeminism as well. Has all of that work and that thinking led you to have some sort of utopian vision for where, we should be going to collectively?
Well, where we should be going, I think life is a process and a journey. I know that's a cliche to say, but that's certainly, I mean, it is true. I mean, we're all, as a politician most unfortunately said the other day, we're all going to die someday. So what's important is the journey. And the journey includes having health care to make the most of our journey. So for me, I think in my fiction, as in my own life, what's important is justice and promoting justice, standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves. And that's something I do a lot of in my own life. I maintain a resistance group in our Red County where we stand up for justice and promote. We're particularly interested in promoting healthcare and environmental health. So I think for me, promoting health, both at the personal level and the environmental level, is most important. The more we can do to save a healthy planet for the ecosystems we have, the better off we will be. And I do have some futuristic views of that. I think one thing that we fail to recognize is that our energy consumption as a global community rises exponentially, particularly in the developed countries. And AI is particularly troubling in the energy consumption of AI is exponential, and I think we need to work at that. The most important thing we can do is manage our energy consumption for the survival of the planet. And I believe that that's eventually going to have to happen off world. I don't often write books associated with Earth, but The Highest Frontier is a near future book about a college on a space satellite. And in that book, I argue that all manufacturing and all energy transducing devices have to be put in space, because otherwise the planet will eventually heat up. So I'm a big fan of space engineering.
Yes, some people are already working on designs to put data centers in Lagrange points, out in
Yeah.
space. And yeah.
Yes, and I agree with that. The data centers have to be out in space. Also, all the factory and manufacturing has to be out in space. Solar energy has to be out of space. It makes no sense to have solar collectors beneath an atmosphere. So I am a big fan of space engineering in that respect.
Yeah, fascinating. Thanks. And your work on health is interesting because, as you said there, it's, when most people think about health, they'll think about humans, right? Public health, it's humans, it's our diseases. But you have a more expansive view of that recognizes it's also about how our health relates to the health of the environment and the ecosystems, but also the interactions between non-human animal health and our health through things like zoonotics and infectious diseases. And, we've just lived through the COVID pandemic, and we seem to have forgotten how bad that can be, and we're charging straight into bird flu now, right? So again, I think that more expansive approach of thinking more broadly about who might matter actually helps us humans as well, right? Rather than just having a narrow focus on the human. But
yes, I see a continuum between human health and planetary health. And what is healthy for humans is healthy for the planet. I think that you mentioned vegetarianism earlier. I mean, the a largely plant-based diet for humans is better for the planet, okay, than far than domesticating animals. But again, I think there's a matter of balance here. I think you can go to extremes. Extremes are not good for the planet either. So and this would be another whole discussion.
yeah, of
But
course, of
yes,
course.
I think putting the health of the planet first will actually support putting the health of humans, because healthy humans need a healthy planet,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And
I
so
agree. I mean, and the reason, I mean, I've been vegan for 7 or 8 years now, and that's very much driven by an ethical concern, right? I look at what happens in a slaughterhouse, and I think that goes against any basic principle of non-violence. So I don't want to support it, and that includes the fact that dairy and egg, animals end up in the same places. So mine is completely ethical, but many people are shifting towards a plant-based, lifestyle and diet for some of those reasons. They're thinking about it for personal health. They're thinking it because of the pollution and the emissions and the zoonotic disease, right? So there are so many different reasons that seem to be pushing us towards, shorter trophic chains and, whatever our ethics are, a way of living that causes less destruction and disturbance to the system as we're part of. So it's an interesting dynamic. Now, there's one final question I wanted to ask, if you've got a few more
yes.
moments, which is one of the themes of your, I think, value system, but it comes through strongly in your sci-fi as well, is this idea of non-violence. And I think many people are richly drawn to that idea because it feels like it has integrity. There is plenty of evidence that it can be very effective pragmatically as a change mechanism, because as I understand some of the social science research, the view is violence is often only useful when it's your enemy that uses the violence, because it improves your credibility and your moral standing, and that can be a part of a way resistance movements win. But I guess there's one classic challenge to maybe an unconditional form of pacifism or non-violence, which is, as far as I can see, there are some humans who are explicitly sadistic, psychopathic, genuinely bad faith actors, totalitarian. And when we're facing those most extreme challenges, personally, I struggle to hold on to any sort of unconditional non-violence. How does your story about non-violence play into those really extreme situations where it might seem that defending others and ourselves is actually the ethical thing to do, even if it uses violence?
So the first, I have to say, I apologize for saying this, but that question, it's the question of light and strategy, right? Would you, you know, I forget how does this exactly go? Would you kill someone to defend your mother? Okay, what if they were what if they were going to rape your mother? And he said, I would interpose myself between them. Right? Do you remember this? Right? Okay, so that's a really old question. I think you know that it's a red herring. Okay, I'm just going to say that.
Yeah, no, that's
So
fine.
non-violence is a positive thing. So you cannot define things negatively, but a positive force. Gandhi referred to it as a himsa, a life force, and understood that. And the point of nonviolence is not to be perfect, because it's like, oh, if you're not perfect, then it's no good. I would recommend the readings of Gene Sharp. Much of my writing, the plot in my books, particularly A Door into Ocean, was my pacifist revolution book, and the plot was based entirely on real life nonviolent revolutions as described by Gene Sharp. Every incident in that book was based on things that have happened in real life, such as resistance to the Nazis and so on. So
And her work is absolutely central to this field, as I understand it. I need to read more. So
Hidden is Actually, it's him, Gene, Gene Sharp.
Of course.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. So Gene Sharp wrote The Politics of Nonviolent Actions, the encyclopedia of nonviolence. So, but if you look at Gandhi, even Gandhi recognized this. So Gandhi was often asked, well, what would you have done in World War II? What would you have told the Jews in World War II and things like that? And so Gandhi actually withdrew from revolution in India to let the British deal with their independence struggle, with their fight from the Nazis. Excuse me. So the point is not, what would you do in these extreme cases? The point is what you do in everyday cases.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And that's what's important. And so that's what I show. Now in my books, I do show the dilemmas. Okay. So in A Door to Ocean, the sharers do face the dilemma of what happens when one of their own kind is a murderer, and it shows how they deal with that dilemma. Okay, so those are dilemmas. No matter what system you have, you face dilemmas, and I think that's not how you define the system. So,
no, thank you.
So, and in many ways today, we have unconsciously absorbed the ethic of nonviolence. It's a little hard. It's hard for you to understand what it was like back in the 80s when I wrote A Door to Ocean. At that time, nonviolence was considered a communist plot. And there was too much memory, and people incorrectly recalled pacifists as being responsible for World War II and things like that.
Yeah.
That's not the case, but that was the mantra. And American society was very militaristic, and I was told
I was a teenager at the time, but faint memories.
You could not publish in the American New York publishers. You could not publish a nonviolent story. That was really not possible. So I eventually found an editor, David Hartwell, who was exceptional and published that book. And when my book came out, it was right at the time of Gorbachev and the Eastern European Revolution, the peaceful revolution. And so the literary circles looked around and said, well, who wrote about that? It was embarrassing that science fiction had nothing like this. There was only one book. That was my book. And Isaac Asimov actually flashed my book on the screen on television and said, this is one book that did this. So, but today it's very different. We have, if you look at the protests in Los Angeles right now, so the media reports make it look as if the entire city is in flames. They show every burnt, there's one or two burnt cars, and they show that, that fills the whole screen. But actually, if you listen carefully on the media reports of the protests, what you hear is the protesters on the bullhorn saying, so be nonviolent, be nonviolent. Okay, you can hear that in the background, and all the protesters, except one or two, are nonviolent. So the protesters in Los Angeles, they are very organized. They're just a few blocks where it's occurring. And what you see on the media is the few disruptors, okay? But they know that they have to be nonviolent. Now, why do they know that? Okay, because they've absorbed the nonviolent system.
And they know that becoming violent would play into the hands of those who oppress them.
Yes, exactly.
Whereas there are other situations which are, more extreme, like facing the Nazis in World War II, where I think the context would be radically different. And as you say, you come back to the point of, genuine dilemmas and
the context. Yes, but even with the Nazis, there were nonviolent resistance movements to the Nazis. There were documented cases, for instance, where certain men were taken from their families and put in a prison, and their wives came out and demonstrated at the prison, and they got released. Okay, so the problem with World War II is not violence or nonviolence. The question is, why did so few people not resist until too late? We live now in a situation similar to the Weimar Republic in many ways, where we have a democracy, but but it's under threat and we're losing it. Why do so few people resist it? Okay. And that was the question. Why did so few people resist the Nazis under Weimar? That's the question. The question is not, what do you do when armies are facing each other later? The question is, when you have a democracy and you could lose it, are you resisting it?
And I think that's the really powerful core of nonviolent resistance, and this philosophy is about that starts early enough, because I think when you get to the stage where you have death squads and gas chambers, and it's too late then, right? And some of the things Gandhi said to the British people and to Jews, I mean, I find ethically horrific, because he was talking about, giving yourself up to slaughter and allowing your children to be.
That's not true.
Are those quotes not true?
Not say that. See, that's a myth. I was told that when I first came to. Now, if you look at the actual letters of Gandhi to the Jews, he said resist.
Yeah.
Okay, his letter. First of all, he said, "I've avoided sending this letter, but I've had so many requests. Here's what I say: above all, resist. I recommend nonviolent resistance, but above all, resist."
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
so
the core
his
message.
letters have been completely misconstrued, and that was a big excuse that was used against the protest movements, and it was an excuse for militarism in the 80s. Okay. The Reagan militarism, what that was one of the propaganda tools they used. It's just not true.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. That's an
I'm
important
not saying that
clarification.
everything Gandhi wrote was perfect. Nobody is
Of course,
perfect.
nobody's
But
perfect.
in fact, the little he addressed to the Jews, that was what he said. So,
thank you. That's an important clarification. Cool. Well, thank you. It's been a fascinating conversation. I've loved hearing your philosophical journey, some themes from your books. I can't wait to read the latest Minds in Transit when it comes out. Is there anything else you wanted to add into the conversation? But also, how would you suggest people follow you, buy your books?
Well, you can find my books at any online bookstore. I used to recommend Amazon, but now I recommend other on. There are some online bookstores that will put some of their profits to actually purchasing books, and so on. So I would say wherever you find my books is great. And I would also like to say that it's been a while since I've been to London, and I really love London, and it's a pleasure talking to someone in London, because there are so many books in London and so many historic places, and the Friends meeting in London is also great. I've appreciated visiting there.
Well, next time you visit, maybe I will have to meet up for a coffee and you can take me to a Friends meeting. It would be a genuine pleasure. Well, thank you again for being on a guest on Sentientism. Please do stay in touch. Thanks.